Okay, good evening, everyone. We're ready to get started. Welcome to Planet Now, Conversations in Environmental Studies. And tonight's particularly interesting webinar, Are Rivers People Too? My name is Joseph Campana. I direct the Center for Environmental Studies here at Rice University, and it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation tonight, which involves a number of special guests, including some wonderful collaborations with colleagues at humanities centers across the country. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Our webinars emphasize a habit of conversation across disciplines, across communities, about important questions facing us right now. Before we get started, I want to say a few other words of acknowledgement. First off, Rice University is located in the sprawling city of Houston on the Gulf Coast of Texas, and we acknowledge that we live on the ancestral lands of the Karankawa, the Sana, the Coetalcan, and the Atacapa Ishak. I also want to make some internal sort of acknowledgements. The Center for Environmental Studies is quite specially located in the Schools of Humanities and Architecture at Rice University. I'm deeply grateful to Deans Kathleen Canning and Igor Marjanovic for all of their support. I also get the great pleasure of working with the co-parent of the Planet Now series and the co-director of the Environmental Studies curriculum. It's a curriculum that stretches across our campus in really wonderful ways. I get to work with lots of wonderful colleagues across disciplines, very unlike mine, including Richard Johnson, Rice's executive director for sustainability. He directs the Environmental Center for Sustainability and Energy Management, and has taught dozens of courses at Rice, including one he's teaching now, Sustainable Futures, with NASA engineer Larry Tops. So we're curriculum committed to talking across divisions and units whenever possible. I also want to say special thanks to the School of Humanities staff, and especially the Diluvial Houston project manager, Weston Twardowski, who is in the backstage here, making everything possible. We're really grateful for his support. Let me now make a couple quick introductions of our panelists for the night for this conversation about environmental personhood. And then from there, I'm going to introduce my colleagues from our sort of collaborating humanities centers to introduce themselves and their centers as well. First off, and I also, as I always like to say, please take the brief introductions to be in inverse proportion to the esteem in which we hold our guests. I just want to create more time for our conversations. So we're incredibly grateful to welcome Kelsey Hample, Assistant Professor of Economics at Furman University, whose work focuses on sustainable policies for those living in rural parts of developing countries. And then we can also welcome Samantha Majhor, Assistant Professor of English at Marquette University, who teaches and researches contemporary Native American literature. And our third speaker tonight, Erika R. the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the University of Utah and Director of the Tanner Humanities Center, who researches the responsibilities of multinational corporations to respect international human rights. Right now, before we hear from each of them, and the plan for tonight, that each will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes, and then we will have some time for crosstalk, and then we'll open things up for broader conversation. But before we get to that, I'd like to welcome my colleagues from the University of Utah, from Furman University, and from Marquette University to introduce themselves and their centers. And actually, if I could ask my colleague Andrew Kim to kick it off.
Thanks so much, Joe. My name is Andrew Kim, and I'm the director of the Center for the Advancement of the Humanities here at Marquette. I'm also an associate professor in theology. At our center, we seek to advance a culture of healing in response to the grand and global challenges of our times, and to draw from the humanities to seek out meaning, purpose, and value. And we include in this the non-human turn, which I know will be spoken about more this evening. And I'm so proud and honored to be with my colleagues here and to take up this really important topic, because we've been doing a lot with integral ecology and attempts to be responsive to Pope Francis's call in Laudato Si for caring for all of creation. And so I'm honored and proud to be a part of this. Thanks so much, Joe.
Okay, let me now welcome my colleague, Michele Speitz from Furman University.
Thank you so much, Joe. And it's an honor to follow Drew as well from Marquette. And I just want to say it's so great to have everyone here tonight. And many thanks go out to Joe and Weston at Rice for hosting tonight's webinar. I'm Michele Speitz, Director of the Furman Humanities Center at Furman University, where I'm also Associate Professor of English. I'll share just a short word about our new Humanities Center. From its inception, just 2 years ago, we at the Humanities Center have been committed to addressing environmental justice issues. Not only do we partner as often as we can with Furman's Shy Institute for Sustainability, but our research center has also co-founded a multi-institutional consortium called Just Environments that Erika, one of our panelists today, is also a member of, that unites humanities centers from universities across and beyond the US to create programming that renders visible the links that bind social justice issues to environmental justice issues, such that we become better able to recognize locally and globally the environmental damage wrought by way of social justice inequalities. And so it becomes impossible to ignore at home and at a distance the social dimensions and costs that accelerate ecological degradation. It is more than an honor to be co-hosting tonight's event, and thanks again for this opportunity.
Thanks so much. And let me welcome our colleague Erika George to say a few words about the Tanner Humanities Center.
Oh, thank you very much, Joe and Weston, for housing our Zoom tonight. And thank you to my co-hosts. It's really, truly an honor to be a part of this. As Michele mentioned, I came to know her through the formation of Just Environments when I was just newly installed in my Humanities Center, which is not new, but rather will be celebrating its 35th anniversary in 2023. So the University of Utah is in Salt Lake City, which is the unceded and ancestral lands of the Goshu, Ute, Eastern Shoshone, and Paiute tribes, and we acknowledge the debt that we owe to those communities, and that is where Tanner Humanities Center is. At Tanner Humanities Center, we focus on humanities engagement and exchange, primarily through three main pillar strengths. One is our research and academic support. We host fellows in residence at the Tanner Humanities Center. The Carolyn Tanner Irish building behind me is where you would reside, were you to join us. We fund faculty and graduate student and undergraduate research fellows for a semester or a year or shorter term projects. The second pillar that sustains us is our public humanities outreach, where we do public programming to Utah audiences, and now in the virtual world to virtually anyone, anywhere in the world or in Utah or beyond that are interested in understanding better our common shared humanity and the humanities role in our appreciation of that. And then our final pillar is support for our K through 12 educators. And we are having a moment in Utah where we're confronting purported efforts to ban books. We support our teachers in K through 12 education through summer research workshops and summer teaching workshops that we call Gateway to Learning, that are primarily focused on our K through 12 educators here, but pairing our faculty with partnering to help enrich offerings in the humanities for our elementary educators. So it is an honor to be here. My other hat is I am a law professor at the University of Utah. I'm affiliated with our Wallace Stegner Environmental Law Center. We also have an environmental humanities program, and we work to build bridges across our campus to do work across our state and beyond. Thank you very much for having this conversation.
Great, thanks so much. And we'll get to hear from Erika again in just a little bit. I just want to say three quick things about tonight's sort of subject before we get to our fantastic speakers. The first, Christopher Stone died last year, and you may hear his name tonight spoken by others who know much more about environmental law than I do. I am a poet and a Shakespeare professor, but I'm someone interested in so many of the questions that lawyers also end up asking, especially around personhood, and especially around the topics we'll talk about tonight. Christopher Stone wrote in 1972 an essay that, that had quite an impact called "Should Trees Have Standing?" And in a certain way, at least from the accounts of it, someone who would not have thought of himself as an environmental lawyer per se, suddenly is launched into a whole different kind of career as a writer and as a thinker. An incredibly interesting essay that for some inaugurates a certain kind of conversation. Who or what can have legal standing? Does that include, say, trees, right? Or in our title, rivers, other natural phenomena or objects? If so, who speaks for them? How would one divine or decide what those interests or rights would be so that one could speak for them? And one might also sort of ask questions, and part of the model has to do with guardianship. So who can represent those voices or those needs or those perceived sort of injuries? And that last term is really important. Is injury the only way? Is it a necessary precondition for this kind of speech, this model, that you can only seek standing as a sort of reparation for some kind of harm? And how do we think about that relative to rivers and trees and so many other natural phenomena? So I'm fascinated to see that sort of unfold in the conversation tonight. It's important, of course, also to really note that this is not the only kind of conversation. So Stone from 72 forward and other aspects of the legal tradition asked this question, but it's one way to put it would be other cultures, other histories, other places, other kinds of knowledge conceive of what we might call natural objects or phenomena in very different ways. And that's, I think, some of what we'll be hearing about tonight as well. How should that impact how we think about environmental harm, environmental reparation, and how we live with the planet of which we are part? Finally, I just want to say quickly, to me, and again, this is a sort of as a non-lawyer and a non-legal scholar, following all these questions, I've been really interested to see one parameter for this, some of these questions about standing and personhood, and they've manifested in a fascinating case, what will maybe be one of many, Juliana versus USA, an argument about who has standing with respect to the future, who has standing to argue for the future. And a group of young people who themselves were not of legal age initially to even launch the case and had to be represented by guardians, sort of launched a suit on behalf of the future of the planet. To me, that is just fascinating, and it's just one of many of the fascinating and important ramifications of this question: are rivers people too? Should trees have standing? And how do we think about the nature of which we are part? With that, I want to really turn things over now to our excellent speakers, and let me sort of hand it off now to Professor Kelsey Hample.
I did that muting thing, you all. Thank you, Joe, and everyone else for having me today. I'm the economist, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to this question. I'm really excited to hear from my panelists and get into this discussion. So as I came to this discussion, I was really thinking about this question you see here. What are the possible gains and losses to granting rivers or other environmental objects legal personhood? And of course, the first thing that came to my mind was not an answer. It was another question, which was a great question that I think I'm learning that maybe Stone is someone I should be reading more of his work. But the question that came to my mind is who speaks for the river? Who exercises that property right? And I think that that thread will pull through some of my other comments today, because I think that's really essential in thinking about what might happen if we grant these property rights. So as I get into, I did come up with some potential gains and some potential losses that we might experience. But before I get into that, I want to give sort of my econ 101, which is here. This is all of it. Don't worry, there's no more econ to this. The first idea is that economists are fundamentally interested in humans. That doesn't mean that we don't care about rivers. We care immensely about rivers. We care about rivers because people fish in rivers. People use rivers to transport objects. People like to look at rivers. They like to hike next to them. They like to hear the beautiful sounds of a river. And future generations would also receive those same ecosystem benefits. And so economists care about rivers because ultimately we care about humans. And I think that'll come up in some of my comments here. And then my other note is just that economists are always thinking about trade-offs. So as I think about these gains and losses that might occur, I definitely think about them coming together. And I think that this is a choice for society. Are these gains worth these costs? So what are the gains? one big gain, and I think that's why we're here, better environmental outcomes, right? Environmental protection. And I want to tell you a little bit about my economist perspective, especially about this, because I think a lot of us come to the same answer. The economist perspective also, maybe Erika will tell us a little bit about this because it's also a legal perspective, comes from this thing called the Coase theorem that says, whenever there's some sort of issue over property rights, if it's difficult to collect one side of that disagreement, of that argument. So for instance, think about a river that's polluted, and there are a lot of individuals, a lot of groups who are damaged by that pollution. If it's difficult to collect all those different groups, then it really does matter who has the property right. Does the river have the right to be clean, or do some other people have the right to pollute that river in some way? And so to the extent that it's difficult to collect people, yeah, I think that there are some really big potential gains here that we could have by reassigning that property right to the river. As I think about what are some losses that we might experience, two main losses really came to my mind as I thought about this. One is about protecting people. There very well, I think almost certainly there will come a time, if we grant rivers personhood, where the right of the river comes right up against the right of people. And sometimes that's exactly what we want, right? If a person's behavior is to pollute that river, maybe that's exactly what we want to do, is change that behavior. And that's how we get that better environmental outcome. But as I think about protecting people, I think about maybe smaller groups of people or more specific groups. So for example, you could think about an Indigenous group that really has a strong maybe cultural or historical connection to some of these ecosystem services, to rivers or forests. By assigning the property right to that river or to that forest, it's going to put that group of people at fault, and that might threaten their ability to continue living the way that they've been living. Again, this might be the exact outcome that we want. We might want to change how these individuals live so that we have less environmental degradation. But I do think that this is a loss worth considering, and this is something that we should be thinking about. My second loss that I thought about is efficiency loss. And I don't mean a drop in GDP. I could talk for hours about GDP and the environment. I think that's a whole different conversation. But again, I want to dive a little bit deeper into this idea of efficiency. So I have an idea here. Consider a farmer who normally diverts some water from a local river to irrigate her fields. If she is no longer able to do that, maybe because the river has the right to keep all of its own water to itself, she's probably going to respond. She's going to substitute somehow. And people are pretty creative, so there are a lot of different substitutes available here. It might be that she starts farming drought-resistant crops. And again, maybe that's exactly what we want, right? An agricultural production that has a lower environmental cost. Maybe that's exactly what we want. But she might have a different substitute, which is to truck in water from a local territory or a neighboring territory that doesn't have the property rights that that farmer is facing, or maybe the water is collected in a sustainable way somewhere else, but it is transported to her. That might have its own environmental degradation. And so the reason I talk about this is because giving that right to the river also incentivizes people to be a little bit more creative, those people who used to interact with that river. And so this makes me think that as you try to give those property rights to the river, we might end up chasing some new and more clever ideas that people have about how to get their production done, how to live their life the way they know how to live it. And I do want to make a note here back to this idea of who exercises that property right. If the river in this case is willing to bargain, we might not have any efficiency loss in this case. For instance, the river might say, if the river could say, the river might say, yeah, you can have some of my water. And in compensation, in return, what I would like for you to plant a few trees. And I would like you to restock some of my fish populations that have been dwindling. And so again, I think it's really important, even on my last potential loss about harming individuals, I think it matters. Is that river willing to bargain? Is that river willing to to apply its property right in some places, exercise its property rights sometimes, maybe against a polluting firm, and choose not to exercise that property right against different groups, maybe against an indigenous group. So a lot of my ideas about this definitely are centered on humans, and I think that we'll have an interesting conversation about that. I think I might learn a lot this evening. And also a lot of my thinking really comes back to who is speaking for a river. When I think about who speaks for a firm, that's a little bit easier for me to imagine, but I'm just an economist. So maybe several people here on this panel can help me have a bigger and better imagination today. So ultimately, to me, the question comes down to, do the gains outweigh the losses? And it depends on how big are those environmental gains that we get? What kinds of losses are we looking at? And what is society's preferences over all of this? Already our society has shown some preference towards environmental protection. I think that there's a big distance that we could potentially go as society, and I think that would help us answer this question about whether these gains outweigh the losses. So that's my little introduction, my lens as an economist on this question, and I'm looking forward to hearing from some of our other panelists.
Great, thank you so much. And we're pleased to now welcome Professor Samantha Majhor.
Midaku yepi chante washte na pechu zapie, samamakiapie. I just wanted to start with a few words in Dakota language, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them as well, but want to acknowledge that I'm coming from Marquette, which is in Milwaukee, and would like to, at Marquette, we like to acknowledge that our campus and Milwaukee are on the homelands and waters of the Menominee, Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, Fox, Mascoutin, Sauk, and Ojibwe nations, who have known this land and water as a relative for millennia, and who remain our hosts on this land today. We also acknowledge that Milwaukee is located along the southwest shores of Michigami, meaning big water in Anishinaabe-Moan, where the Milwaukee River, Menominee River, the Kinnickinnic River all meet right next to Lake Michigan. And so I start with a little bit of our the land acknowledgement that we have formulated here at Marquette, because when we were thinking about it, the creators of it, co-creators, I was also on the panel, found it really important to make it not just a land acknowledgement, but a land and water acknowledgement. And part of that is because the place where we're at is defined by water. Milwaukee, like so many places where people have congregated across time, is a water place. We have these three rivers coming together, and one of our right on the shores of our Great Lakes. And so therefore, because this is a place of water abundance, it's a place that has always been naturally abundant. And so people have been gathering here for centuries and centuries, thousands of years. The environment shapes us in that way, shapes our cities, shapes how we move around the world, of course, feeds and nourishes us in so many different ways. But so I'm here, my specialty is in literature and contemporary Native American literature, and more broadly trained in Native American and Indigenous studies as well. And I am Dakota and Assiniboine descendant. And so I've had the great privilege to be part of a Humanities Without Walls research grant for the past couple of years, and it's entitled Indigenous Art and Activism Along the Mississippi River in Changing Climates. And what we've done as a group, an interdisciplinary group from a couple different institutions and different disciplines, is we've traveled along the Mississippi River from the headwaters down to the Delta. And we've connected with Indigenous artists, Indigenous makers, and looked at various tribal perspectives and histories, connections to the river across time. and thought about, what are Indigenous responses to changing climates along this particular river. Some of the artists and the folks we've talked to include Sharon Day, who's Ojibwe, and she is a water walker or a Nibi walker. These are a group of Ojibwe women who practice ceremony, which is quite traditional, in connection with water, prayer for water. They go on water walks, often carrying water from one part of the river to another to help the river remember itself. We talked to Monique Verdun, who's in the Delta and has seen in her community extreme changes due to climate change. In fact, the whole community sort of being flooded, and this potentially being a permanent situation. Another artist is Chitimacha artist Sarah Sense, who has studied traditional basket weaving techniques from the Chitimacha tribe. And it's interesting to think about some of the ways these artists connect to river and water spaces. For Sarah Sense, for example, Chitimacha basketry and tradition relies on particular reeds and grasses that grow along the river. And with climate change, we see these particular grasses endangered. What Sarah does in her artwork so brilliantly is, first of all, understand and bring back some of the patterns that had been lost to the Chitimacha during the assimilation process, the boarding school era, so on and so forth. But she now interweaves, creates those patterns with photography, digital artwork, things like that. But it's remembering these particular grasses, these particular reeds, and how they work. Another artist that I've connected with that I like to think about in connection with these questions about water and peoplehood when it comes to rivers and water spaces are the Menominee Black Ash basket weavers here in Wisconsin. For instance, Sherry Lapel is someone who does traditional black ash basket weaving. Now, black ash is a particular type of ash tree because it's aquatic, unlike other types of ash trees. So the black ash is particular in this. And because of how it grows in the water, it creates these channels that creates a particular type of bark that is particularly useful and grows in a way that creates these strips of for the baskets that have a particular sheen, and by its nature, these are what these trees are used for, harvested for. And of course, now we have the threat of the black ash, the ash borer beetle, okay, which has traveled along Lake Michigan. It's coming up north toward the Menominee forest, which is an incredible, Menominee are known for their forestry. And so the Menominee are strategizing. How do we preserve in anticipation for this idea that we do not have really any control over the spread of these ash borer beetles that are going to wipe out all of the ash trees and are steadily doing that. How do we carry on our traditions? How do we save seeds? What are our strategies for staving off the death of these trees, which are culturally important? How are we going to pass along all the traditions, the songs, the language, the practice of making baskets, the artistry, the language that goes along with that particular role in the community? How do we preserve that when the black ash trees are gone? And Indigenous peoples over and over again for a long time now have been strategizing in this way in connection to other than human life that we interact with on a regular basis. So I think about these things, and I think about the Whanganui River as sort of that. I could be corrected. I think it's the first case where the river was given legal rights and legal peoplehood, the Whanganui in New Zealand in 2017. And that came out of a 150-year legal battle between Whanganui iwi, the people, the Maori people of New Zealand, their connection to that river, and the New Zealand government. So to me, this advocacy for peoplehood, for recognizing the sovereignty of river spaces in particular, has been something that Indigenous people have long been involved in. And so I just want to go back to, I opened up here with a word in Dakota, which is a word I was taught as I am a Dakota language learner. To say whenever addressing a crowd formally, we start with this word Midaku, and it means all my relatives. Okay, so I said, hello, all my relatives. In Dakota thinking, when you're about to speak, our words hold power. And so in order to speak, one needs to do so with care. And one does that by acknowledging that all those who will hear my voice, I have an obligation to speak well, an obligation to be a good relative to those who can hear my voice. And in Dakota thinking, when I say relative, it doesn't just mean human beings. It's all our relatives, all those who can hear me. And that includes our other than human relatives. So in Indigenous thinking, there's always this relative making that interesting to think about legal and economic perspectives, because while it sounds, sort of like nice, it is quite formal in its diplomacy in a way of looking at the world. And so Midaku Yepi, I look forward to talking more about our different perspectives and thinking about how we relate to the river, human and other than human, and how much we rely on our waters and protecting our waters, and perhaps considering the river's own personhood or sovereignty and why that's important. So thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you so much, Samantha. I'd like to now welcome our third speaker, Professor Erika George.
Thank you very much. And that was tremendous. There's such food for thought here. And I want to suggest that personhood is as over time law has imagined it. So I'd like to pick up on that point about relationship. I am going to share screen, or attempt to show, let's see, a brief and incomplete chronology of the evolution of thinking in this area in law, mostly domestic, but I'll be pulling in other places because that's where there has been more creative progress. So nature as person. I've talked to you already about my center. We have 5 national parks and protected monuments that are contested in the state of Utah. Bears Ears has found its way in and out of court. But I'd like to begin with the seismic shift of what a significant move it is to transfer legal categories from being property to personhood. When I teach my students constitutional law and equal protection clauses, I will start with the 3/5 clause before we get to the 14th Amendment, where we had law that recognized human persons as less than human, or didn't recognize a class of people, those who were enslaved, as persons. And as chattel property, it was the right of the property owner, the economic privilege, to do what they would with their property, the other persons not fully recognized as such in law. That model of recognition of having legal personhood as a human person brought with it a range of rights. Not having the protection of being a person, being rendered property, strips you of those rights or doesn't recognize that you have them. So Joe at the beginning mentioned Christopher Stone's infamous, famous law review article that appeared in the Southern California Law Review in 1972. At the same time, the UN was meeting and ultimately came out with the Stockholm Declaration in that same year. And there were a few things I wanted to point out about Christopher Stone's article as a point of departure. That was perhaps, at least in English US legal writing, the first time that someone was inviting a paradigm shift pushing towards inanimate natural objects having legal personality. With legal personality, again, one gets recognition of the courts, which means you can protect your rights, you've got privileges, you've got immunities, and that's how we've conceptualized it in US legal thinking. He invited a rethinking of our relationship to nature, and centering nature, not a human interest in the natural object, as the relevant point of inquiry for a court. And he did this in a few ways. I think it's also interesting to note that Christopher Stone was a part of the American Association for Law School's Humanities section. So he was a humanist. The Law and Humanities section sponsored this research, and it was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So I don't know if that was known to our community. So what his project was about extending and expanding the relevant scope of inquiry. And as moral development of humans increased, we have extended rights beyond the narrow confines of being male and white. And much of the article actually runs through the expansion and extension of rights to formerly enslaved people, to women, to children, and recognizing that modeling how law looks at who's entitled to personhood has evolved over time. It's not impossible, it's simply a failure of the imagination when we fail to do so. And his Should Trees Have Standing took him in a direction towards environmentalism, but really it was a law review article on standing. One has standing in court to be able to sue. It's being recognized before the court to claim usually an injury. Stockholm is an international instrument that was negotiated and was the first time that pioneered an eco summit that ultimately led to the development of the United Nations Environmental Program, which is another body that introduces environmental declarations and international law formation. There was an articulation of the recognition of a human right to a clean and healthy environment. Environmental law evolved separate and apart from human rights law, which I think is quite telling. Only in the past few years have these interconnected, concluding last year in the first time the United Nations formally recognized the actual human right to a clean and healthy environment. Though many countries across the world had done so previously, there's a solidifying of legal appreciation for the recognition of these rights. Countries with large indigenous populations were ahead of the game in recognizing that nature has rights that we must respect. Ecuador's constitution doing so formally for the first time in 2008. As I said, this chronology is incomplete, but these are kind of landmark points of interest for those interested in how international law is developing towards recognizing nature as having its own personality in its own right to speak for itself of sorts. And I want to talk to the question of who speaks for the environment a little later on. Because I am coming to you from Utah, our neighboring state is Colorado. It's coming upon the centennial of the Colorado River Compact, which is a negotiated framework for use of that waterway. A few years ago, there was a claim made in litigation that ultimately failed that tried to get a court to appreciate that the river itself should be a party to the litigation as a person, not those with interests in it or riparian rights, but the injury to the river itself was an injury to the river, not those holding rights in the river. Ultimately unsuccessful, but some very interesting briefing on the subject matter. Again, in Latin America, some successes and wins in courts, and continued experimentation that's going on to this day. What'll turn the tide, I think, will be, frankly, how we think of framing rights and what the environment is entitled to regenerate, to exist, to not be polluted. These are movements around the world where we're seeing some progress in different courts. There were just a couple I wanted to touch on, but we're seeing this language of rights translated across and through very different legal systems, civil law systems in the Romance language areas, common law descended systems in Asia and in the United States. I think where legal imagination can begin to appreciate personhood is acknowledging that we have a range of things populating the legal imagination that we do give rights to, not to coextensively with humans, like a corporation doesn't have the right to remain silent. You have to turn over your books and documents and your accounting. But we've seen the courts be quite willing to recognize corporate speech, or even arguably corporate religious faith, if we read Hobby Lobby. What we see is once personhood has been granted to an entity, something is imbued with legal personality, courts are then treating them with respect, meaning they'll hear claims that there is a right to remedy, there is an opportunity to enjoin acts that might harm it being the legal person. And on behalf of corporations, their lawyers speak for them, right? So ontologically, one of the questions we were asked to think about is what would be problematic about granting legal personhood to nature. Certainly there's been a lot of blowback on corporate personhood in the lay population, not lawyers who are willing to accept legal fictions, but how does this make sense? And the way it makes sense is just having an entity that can adjudicate and function in the space of law. Were we to give that to nature, what could happen? What could go right? What could go wrong? I think where courts are able to comprehend is frankly looking through the lens of some indigenous epistemologies. This is appreciating that there might be spiritual or religious interests in land. It's not still quite at the level of the land in and of itself having value, but the case that was mentioned by Samantha out of New Zealand, many of us watched with fascination and awe because the land was given its rights and there was a negotiated agreement on who got to speak for that land. It's a multi-voiced interest, the state, the government, the indigenous peoples, which necessitates learning how to speak to one another about our relationship to land, how our relationships may differ, and how to mediate and negotiate those differences. Another win, water bodies in India, the Ganges and Yamuna rivers have been recognized as having legal personality. And Ecuador's cloud forest has recently been recognized as having its own rights and interests. We've not seen that kind of success in the US, but we are seeing more interesting legal arguments raising rights in and of themselves. I wasn't going to talk about the young plaintiffs in the climate change litigation, but one of the things we understand in international environmental law is intergenerational obligations. And that's where they're rooting their claims, that something is due them. It's their interest and right in having a clean and healthy environment as distinct from the environment itself having a right. Either way, those are advances if we are interested ultimately in protecting the planet that we inhabit. So I see this strategically as something that's important to continue to advance. And on the question of who's going to speak to the environment, I'm increasingly worried that it may not be anyone. There are two questions, there's a major questions doctrine that this bench is particularly engaged in. This is the idea that federal agencies shouldn't be given questions to determine if they are of economic interest or broader political social concerns. It's confusing, it's a mess, but there are two cases before this court this term challenging whether or not the EPA can in fact enforce provisions of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, which will make it difficult for administrative agencies that are tasked with environmental protection to do the work of protecting in a robust way. So these are things that colleagues at advocacy organizations like Earth Justice, their tagline is because the earth needs a good lawyer, so they already purport to represent planet, client Earth, are really truly worried about. So I tend to see the upside of personhood to the environment, because I've seen how powerful legal personhood can be in vindicating rights. That said, rights aren't absolute. It is possible to negotiate rights, to mediate rights. So I appreciated Kelsey's thought experiment of, if the river was willing to negotiate, hey, you can use this if you restock or replenish. Maybe those are the kinds of conversations we would have with planet, client, river, mountain, other inanimate earth object. The other issues, I don't think any of these are insurmountable. I think we just haven't imagined the answers yet, would be which rights would the inanimate natural object get? Would it probably not get a right to vote, not get a right against self-incrimination? So we'd need to delineate what those would be. Ontological choices need to be made. Would it be parts of forests, stands of trees, different parts of different waterways, the hydraulic cycle? And I think those would work out over time, over the course of litigation. There's also the matter of where nature is. Is nature on private property or in public trust, on public lands? There are legal reasons, I think, to continue to press for personhood of inanimate objects. And I think more importantly, there are social and psychological reasons at this time, when we're facing the challenges of climate change, to have an argument that has greater strength and power in legitimating the claims and calls of nature. So final plug, we've got several fellows who are doing work on environmental humanities, and I'll put in the chat more information about Tanner, but we have an annual environmental humanities justice prize, and one of the child climate plaintiffs will be our prize winner, and her name is Anaya. I will put information about her work in the chat as well. But on balance, I think moving towards personhood hasn't really harmed any of the entities previously excluded by law from being part of the human family, like Black people, like women, like children. And perhaps we can expand the legal imagination a bit more to make more of us safe and deepen our relationship to where it is we are and how we relate to the land. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. That was fantastic. So right now, I want to say two things. So to our panelists, I'd love you to bring your cameras back on and sort of join me on for our conversation. I want to say a couple things to the audience while our fantastic panelists are kind of getting ready. One thing I want to say is, like most webinars, and many of you are very familiar with them by this point, you can ask questions in the Q&A function. You'll find that on the bottom of your screen. So please start registering some questions. Some have already popped up. And I just also want to say, sort of thank our panelists, because that was a fantastic, and I learned so much of this. I also realized, and I know, okay, I'm a poet and a literary critic, but it's fundamentally so much about the imagination. I love from Kelsey's sort of query, what if economics were organized not just around, say, human interest versus this other kind of interest, but if you could answer the question, if the river could speak, it would say, right? And I love too to kind of come to Erika's, the sense that the question is really about both failures of the imagination that need to be redressed, and how an expanded sort of legal imagination provides incredibly both incredibly practical and strategic options, but also a better way of thinking about living with the world. And in between, part of that imagination, and I sort of love this about Samantha's remarks, which is the sense we need other languages. Maybe, yes, we start strategically with certain kinds of opportunities and certain kinds of discourse, but what if it were relative making, right? And I thought I heard Samantha talking much more too, not just about speaking, not speaking, which is very important. Okay, I'm a poet, but also connecting. And what does that mean exactly? So I thought there's just a really kind of beautiful array of thoughts. So while our participants are maybe thinking about questions they want to lodge in the Q&A, I would just love to invite our panelists just to have a little crosstalk now too.
Thank you both. I already feel that my imagination is expanding, right, as I watch the time click away. So I'm very thankful for both of your perspectives, and I'm excited to dig in more.
Okay. I guess a question on trade-offs and moving away from a property interest in the natural objects. I'm interested because law and econ is a very salient way of looking at environmental law. How granting personhood might change or tip that trade-off balance in your estimation? Like, how are environmental economists thinking about this? Because I think there's a lot of stuff that simply isn't priced in that gets, and the costs are passed on.
Yeah, I think that trade-off all comes down to what are the incentives and who is the agent. I mean, in economics, all we talk about are agents. And so this notion of turning a river into an agent is a really interesting and exciting one for me, because we've not thought about that. We've always been thinking about agency, about agents who can make a claim, who can exercise that property right. And it is the exercise of that property right that actually makes change. If you have the right and don't exercise it, that nothing would happen. So I think so to me, it all comes down to, I was really interested, Erika, in your summary of some of these recent international cases where they have identified who is speaking for these rivers. And to me, that's such an interesting idea to think about how those groups come together, how they set an agenda, how they come to a conclusion, what kind of conclusion, majority conclusion, might they come to, and thinking about, to my mind, all those groups might have slightly different incentives, and thinking about how those play out through that bargaining would have a really big impact on all these trade-offs.
And, there is bargaining that's occurring on who's writing amicus briefs to what courts. I mean, I'm just speaking technically. Should it be Sierra Club? Should it be the Natural Resources Legal Defense Fund? Should it be the Gulf communities in their own right, maybe co-written, ghost-written, because sometimes somebody else needs to take the lead and be the plaintiff, which is what I think is so exciting about the youth suits, right? Sure, they have to be represented by guardians, but much in the same way that we have all kinds of appointed guardians. We have guardian ad litem. So just because there is a different way that a legal person is in law doesn't mean they don't get to be recognized or have their claims not be cognizable by the court. Right now, you don't have a claim in your own right if you are not a legal person. And I will say this cuts a lot of different ways. So Joe mentioned my research is really on multinational corporations. Guess what doesn't have personality under international law? Corporations. So Facebook is not France. France can regulate. Facebook technically can't, but they have all this shadow power around issues of speech or even their procurement chains that touch different places. So public and private personhood, whether you're a legal subject or object, allows for a lot of slippage. So maybe on one of the downsides, if we do fix into personhood, I don't know, I still think they're mostly upsides, but some people caution, be careful what you wish for. If you grant a corporation legal personality thinking it'll come with state responsibility, what if it just comes with rights and without the responsibilities? The one thing I thought about is, at least from a US perspective, we think about vindicating rights in courts. We really don't have a robust responsibilities discourse. My sense is that some Indigenous communities do. I know the African Peoples and Charter of People's Rights has a just much more robust sense of, okay, if you have these rights, you have these responsibilities, and it's written along the lines of duty, not just power. On the surface, it can look very patriarchal and sexist, but if you have the duty, then you also get the privilege. So.
That very much makes me think again of Samantha's sort of points, because I was thinking, okay, so relative making is about intimacy and obligation, maybe a good version of obligation. But so anyway, maybe I'll pass the baton to you if you don't mind, Samantha.
Yeah, and just going off of that, I think there is a real, I'm most familiar with Dakota philosophies and thinking, and also Ojibwe, but there is a general sense in Indigenous communities of this relative making as practice, as diplomatic. Of course, government to government, we think about a lot, but in Dakota thinking, in most Indigenous thinking, it isn't explicitly human to human, where you go through a process of relative making, and that relative making isn't, oh, we're a big happy family now. It is, I have obligations to you and you have obligations to me. And so thinking about the ways that the river serves us in so many ways, gives us life. Okay, water is life. Miniwi Choni, the Dakota phrase that popularized at Standing Rock. Water is life and it gives life. We all need it for life. And so that hooks us all, all the communities connected to those waters, whether we're thinking of them as resources, but that doesn't tend to be the Indigenous point of view, but as a relationship that is necessary. And so then what are our obligations to the river? And to me, it's very Indigenous thinking to say, what are our obligations to 7 generations down the road? And thinking about peoplehood as the river, just like, the various beings on the planet, has an innate sovereign right to live. One of the folks in the chat pointed out this sort of question of the language of inanimate object, when this is clearly quite a living, breathing thing. Thinking about how this gets sort of parsed in legal ways as far as like what river. If we look at the Mississippi River on the map, we have this thing that, starts in, northern Minnesota and goes all the way down to the Gulf. But if you really look at it, I mean, it looks like the whole lungs of the United States with all of its tributaries and everything that connects into it. And so it really, I think, is a challenge to figure out those details. I think it's also interesting to look at Native law and tribal law here in the United States, because if we think about the way that treaty rights have been thought of, and not just about land, but about right to access and right to practice one's culture, practice religion. And in order to do those things, like I'm talking about here with, for instance, I was talking about the black ash trees, if those things don't exist, how do we practice those things? Well, Indigenous people are strategizing out of necessity and trying to save these things, preserve. But at the same time, you think of the fishing rights battles that have gone on in Wisconsin. What implications might those have for this broader these legal pathways? So those are just my thoughts as the conversation was going on.
And Samantha, I just have to jump in on what you said. What is our obligation 7 generations from now? To me, that sounds like economics. So now I think I'm picking up a tiny bit of your language and I'm feeling much better for it. Thank you.
So I really appreciate, Samantha, and how you describe also the obligation and relative making as diplomacy, as negotiation, because it also occurs to me, and this came out of, so what's come up is that, and some of this may have only gotten exchanged amongst the participants in the Zoom, the panelists, which is that one of our guests, Susan Chadwick, brought in some context about the Christopher Stone case, and also queried this term inanimate object. But the reason I mentioned is I thought, well, also we're dealing with incredibly complex phenomena, right? So where should trees have standing? Well, did he mean a tree? Did he mean an entire forest? Is it the fungal network that connects them all? Is it? And we have to sort of, and this is also why we need our colleagues in the sciences to sort of be in conversation with the environments we live in and with. But it raises a lot of complicated questions about competing needs and rights at times. And it just seemed to me, Samantha, from what you said, well, that's also a model for a kind of forms of debate and conversation about those needs and obligations, because they also aren't going to be easy always, right? Even in the best of circumstances.
Yeah, we all, for relatives and relative making, we all know what it is to have a sibling argument or something like that. It isn't easily done, but it is a frame of mind that sort of allows for the work to be done.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just chatting in the chat with Susan, who may be one of my fellow lawyers, but as you know, standing is difficult, becoming increasingly difficult to allege. So environmental groups that want standing have to find a plaintiff that has the right injury. So recognizing the potential risk of future injury for the climate plaintiffs is actually pretty encouraging. I know it's survived dismissal in Oregon. It's going to have a long way to go, but in other countries it is easier. And in Ecuador, because there is the personhood right accorded to nature, anyone can have standing. So that's another benefit of recognizing the personhood. I'm sure courts would then have to fight out who has better standing or competing standing claims, but we've worked that out previously. There are ways that minority and majority shareholders and corporations negotiate it out. So there'll be complications, but conceptually, I think it's a move forward.
Well, Erika, this also maybe answers a question I was sort of half forming, again, as a complete non-legal expert of any kind, which is the tie to injury is something I thought a lot about as I just read again as a literary critic, trying to think about things happening with trees and forests in Renaissance Europe, which was my reason to get into Christopher Stone, oddly enough. But I was thinking about that tie to injury, and it sounded like from what you just said, that part of the evolution or the future imagination is how can it not just be about injury, right? Which is, of course, important. Redress for injury is critical. But on the other hand, it sounds like there's an evolution or a kind of movement towards being able to think of personhood, not just in response to an injury, as if that's the only thing that would create the kind of conditions to be a kind of person, right, in terms of the natural world. So sorry if that seems a little that's ill-formed, but I've always tried to think about that sort of necessity of injury as part of this, and you've suggested, I think, ways out of that too, that's part of how this may advance as we imagine better this kind of category.
I don't know if I intended to. I mean, maybe,
and that may not be right or useful, but it's always been fascinating to me. Yeah.
You aren't before court unless you have a claim. You need to have an injury in fact, otherwise something is moot. Now that's just a very narrow way of thinking about it. You have to have an actual case in controversy to reach a court. The things that we're seeing are very narrow. They're always going to be something terrible, because otherwise you'd have worked it out without involving the legal system. So this is, at least in the very narrow framing in which I'm operating, about getting access to remedy. Right to remedy is recognition of the person. Certainly you can be a person without injury, and still be of legal consequence. You just wouldn't be in conflict and before courts. So there'd be nothing to opine upon. But yeah, so it's hard for me to get out of the injury protection, rights vindication mindset. We might talk about just respect for rights, independent of remedy for violations and acknowledgement of a right, but it's very intertwined with, if you have a right, you've got a privilege to have access to remedy for it to be fully meaningful.
Right.
So
we've got maybe one question, which maybe is a good one to kind of end with. It's actually coming from Michele. So is there a problem orienting law and economics around anthropocentric dynamics? In other words, and this is something that literary critics think a lot about when we think about personification. Is this good or bad? Is it always problematically human-centered? Are we always giving in a problematic way human qualities to other things because that's the only way we understand them, or are there ways beyond that? And I think, again, it's not an easy question to answer, and it's been asked for millennia, one could argue, but it seems to be an important way to think. Is this sort of trapping us in some ways, and is that some of what we also are working to have better kind of imagine our way out of?
Ooh, I have not thought about that, just because so much of what we do in law is anthropomorphized. Like, you need legal personality for us to see you, but we have all kinds of things we can't see, right? We've got robotics now and technology that may invite us to think in different ways. So I don't have an answer to that question other than it's an interesting problematic, and it's probably problematic. Do we really want to replicate some of the anthropocentric dynamics that we do have that got us to where we are now? Or maybe we can be better humans, which is, I think Andrew has the next note about inviting us to imagine being otherwise than we are. Yeah.
I would say, from my very narrow, very economics, very human focused perspective, that there is currently a problem. And I think that there could be a couple of solutions. My very narrow training tells me that our problem is that we haven't thought enough about humanity. We haven't thought enough about those future generations, about the obligations that humans have to keep this home that we live in nice. You know, I own a home. I try to change my light bulbs. I change my air filters. I try to have taken on some of that obligation. So not to say that that is the more appropriate solution in any way, but I think you could go in a direction of, I think, of doing better at recognizing a larger spectrum of what it means to be human and what those obligations might come with. But I'd love to hear from Samantha if you have something to say about this.
So thank you. Yeah, and my thought is, we tend to think of anything with agency as human, but really the problem isn't personifying it. The problem is we think of it as personifying, right? Really, in Indigenous philosophies, Indigenous sciences, and I think more and more, especially since we've all come together and begun to share our ideas more, since I'm talking specifically since, turns in the academy around 1970s, where we're referring to do plants have standing or do trees have standing? It is this decentering of the human. And in that, an acknowledgement, it's not sort of a tossing away of the human, but rather an inviting and acknowledging the common agency, the animacy that flows, through everything. I feel like I'm talking about the force, but but the idea that to personify, as we traditionally think about it, isn't really to personify everything, but to understand that trees talk to each other, and that rivers have languages and communities, and form these things so that aren't unfamiliar to us, because we are, we could sort of I don't know what the word would be, but like, instead of personifying nature, we're like naturalizing humans, in legal terms, that's a whole different thing. But, seeing it as one is the same, rather than worrying too much about, are we taking this thing that's other and making it too much of ourselves? Well, maybe we should, or it's just the decentering isn't so much shoving off to the side as acknowledging what already exists.
Yeah, and Samantha too, and maybe one other way to put it also is that relative making is kind of dynamic, and both, it's not just two entities, but let's just say for two, both entities would be transformed by it, right? And I think that's some of what this sort of and I really appreciate Erika just referring to this, the idea that we're addressing failures of the imagination. So we need to imagine the human better, right? And this is part of it. And it's a kind of, that's part of that relative making dialogue, which is this mutual transformation. All right, I just want to invite our guests, any last remarks they want to make before we, oh, okay, so we do have a kind of question that's coming in from an anthropologist and land use lawyer. Can you recommend introductory readings on these issues? So maybe, yes, it would be great if each, we've mentioned a few things have come up already, but if everyone on the panel wouldn't mind suggesting something to read, I think that's fantastic, because I would love a reading list myself.
Oh, okay, I will just go first. I would read, Yvonne, the UN resolution recognizing the human right to a clean and healthy environment. The current UN Special Rapporteur on that topic is the Canadian David Boyd. I think he's at UBC Law, and before that was John Knox. So if you're into policy, nerding out, their initial reports, because they were multi-stakeholder consultative, shows some of the dynamics of how that conversation ultimately reached some political success in getting this declaration. I love the classics, Christopher Stone. I love the Lorax. I do that with my nieces. But Columbia's Sabin Institute on climate, they are tracking a lot of the litigation. And I like to go through and look at the briefing and look at what they're citing. Some people are citing literature and history, not just prior precedent, because sometimes prior precedent is in. So I think there's really a rich conversation happening, right? Oh, yeah, thank you. Oh, wow, it was right there. So I would start with that. But I'd want to hear what literature and beautiful things I should be reading. Ah, there it is. Yeah.
I just put a couple of things in the chat. Highly recommend works by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Braiding Sweetgrass is the one that most people have read. She also has one on mosses, but wonderful essay writer and you know, botanist coming from the blending of Western and Indigenous thinking and sciences. And then I'm a huge fan of Kim Tallbear and her work. Her book that's published is Native DNA, which is really fascinating. She's also in the sciences, but more of her, I would seek out her blogs, her papers, and articles. Her more recent work is really on particularly Dakota thinking and relative making, other than human relations and things like that. So, and there are many more. And then, you know, there's a lot going on in Native literature that is, you know, sort of in concert with and inspired by Afrofuturisms. We're talking about Indigenous futurisms. How are we envisioning the future? And a lot of it has to do with envisioning climate and what happens and how we contend with, and for Native perspectives, how we continue to survive and maintain cultural connections, practices, things like that. So lots of good stuff in that realm if you're interested in speculative fiction.
Okay, Kelsey, any recommendations from you?
None that can top what we just heard. I'm making my own reading list as we speak.
Okay, well, listen, I'm so grateful for all of your time, and so I want to bring this to a close. So first, let me thank our fantastic panelists, Kelsey, Samantha, and Erika. I especially have learned a lot from the conversation. I want to thank Michele and Drew and Erika for putting this together. I hope it'll be the first of many collaborations, a lot of important conversations to have, and I am grateful for the wisdom of my colleagues, which is inspiring and instructive. And as I sort of close things out, I just want to say a few things. This event is being recorded, and so you'll be able to find it, and this is where you'll find all of our recordings of our Planet Now webinars and some other events at the Center for Environmental Studies here at Rice. I've just popped that in the chat, and I'm also putting here a link to some listings for our upcoming events. I'll just say that very, very quickly before we go. This has been a fantastic conversation, and we're looking forward to another on February 21st at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, Prepared Air, which we've developed with our colleagues in architecture, especially trying to think across many points of view, architecture, but also engineering and the humanities and arts, about something we think a lot about in these mask-filled days, which is the quality of air. And it's certainly, COVID was not the only reason we have reason to think about and worry about air quality. So that's Prepared Air on February 21st at 6 p.m. And we'll also be having a webinar on March 23rd, Justice in the Food System, that my colleagues here at Rice, Sophie Sapp-Moore and Jade Hagen, will be conducting with folk thinking about food justice experts from around the country, but also from here in Houston, thinking about our kind of local food, urban food environment. So again, I want to thank everybody, and I welcome you back to some future Planet Nows, and have a very good and healthy and safe night. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.